The city stretched out before them, a sprawling graveyard of steel and stone. Blackened skyscrapers loomed against a sky choked with ash, their glass windows shattered long ago. Broken streets were littered with rusted vehicles, their doors hanging ajar like forgotten memories. Not even the wind stirred here. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Elias led the way, his boots crunching softly against the cracked asphalt. He moved with the deliberate precision of a man used to surviving, his eyes scanning every shadow for signs of danger. Behind him, Mira followed closely, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of her pack. She adjusted the strap nervously, her sharp eyes flickering to the side whenever a sound, even imagined, broke the stillness. Carter brought up the rear, his usual smirk replaced with a grim expression. He clutched his satchel of medical supplies tightly, his head on a swivel. The factory stood at the edge of the city, a massive structure untouched by the decay surrounding it. Its steel walls gleamed unnaturally clean under the murky sunlight, as though time had skipped over it entirely. No cracks marred its surface, no vines dared creep along its edges. Even the air felt different as they approached, heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. "This place gives me the creeps," Carter muttered, breaking the silence. His voice echoed faintly against the factory walls, and he winced at the sound. Mira glanced back at him, her brow furrowing. "Everything gives you the creeps," she said, though her own voice wavered slightly. Elias stopped at the factory's main entrance, his hand hovering over the touchpad embedded in the door. He studied it for a moment before pulling a battered notebook from his pocket. Flipping through its pages, he found the access code scrawled in shaky handwriting. The numbers were a relic from another scavenger, one who hadn't made it out of a different factory alive. Elias entered the code with practiced efficiency. The door hissed open. Inside the factory was a different world. The air was cool and sterile, carrying the faint hum of machinery. Rows of conveyor belts stretched out before them, perfectly aligned and gleaming under fluorescent lights. Robotic arms moved in synchronized precision, assembling objects with mechanical grace. The contrast to the desolation outside was jarring, almost surreal. Mira stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "It's like nothing happened here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let it fool you," Elias said, his tone grim. "These places are traps. They were designed to keep running no matter what. Doesn't mean they're safe." They moved deeper into the factory, their eyes darting between the machines. Boxes rolled off conveyor belts, each sealed tightly and stamped with a generic logo. Carter reached for one, prying it open with his knife. Inside, he found rows of neatly packed cans of food, their labels pristine. "Well, at least it's not a total bust," he said, slipping a can into his bag. He hesitated before adding another. "Feels wrong, though, like we're stealing." "There's no one left to steal from," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the machines. He wasn't looking at the food or the boxes, but at the precision with which everything moved. The factory operated without hesitation, as if it still had a purpose, as if it were still serving someone. They came to a stop near the end of a conveyor belt, where a single crate sat waiting. It was larger than the others, sealed with rivets instead of tape. Mira frowned, stepping closer. The air around the crate felt different, warmer, with a faint, sickly sweet odor that made her stomach churn. "What's in this one?" she asked, glancing at Elias. He knelt beside the crate, running his fingers along its smooth surface. "Only one way to find out," he said, pulling a crowbar from his pack. The lid groaned as he pried it open. Inside, something glistened. At first, it looked like a mass of gel, its surface reflecting the harsh light. But as Elias reached out with the crowbar, the gel shifted, revealing a hint of texture, like skin, translucent and wet. Beneath it, something moved, pressing faintly against the surface as though testing its confines. Mira stumbled back, her hand clamped over her mouth. "What the hell is that?" Carter leaned in for a closer look, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "It's alive," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Whatever it is, it's alive." Before anyone could react, a sound echoed through the factory. It wasn't the hum of machines or the clatter of conveyor belts, but something deeper, more guttural. A wet, dragging noise punctuated by faint clicks. It came from the shadows, somewhere beyond the rows of machinery. Elias stood, his hand gripping the crowbar tightly. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one noise, but many, overlapping in a discordant rhythm. Something scraped against metal, followed by a faint rhythmic tapping. Elias motioned for the others to stay close, his body tense. A shadow shifted near one of the conveyor belts. Mira gasped, pointing. "There!" They turned in time to see a figure dart into the darkness. It moved with unsettling speed, its form indistinct but unmistakably unnatural. Elias's grip tightened on the crowbar as he stepped forward. The others followed reluctantly, their breaths shallow. The shadows seemed to come alive around them, shifting and writhing. The wet, clicking sounds grew louder, echoing off the factory walls. Elias stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal the others. Ahead of them, something crawled into the light. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its body was long and sinewy, covered in a patchwork of glistening flesh and metallic plating. Its limbs were spindly but strong, ending in razor-sharp claws that clicked against the factory floor. Its head was a twisted amalgamation of organic tissue and exposed circuitry, with eyes that gleamed like molten glass. The creature tilted its head, its many eyes locking onto the intruders. For a moment it simply watched, its body twitching with nervous energy. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. Elias shoved Mira out of the way as the creature's claws struck, slicing through the crate behind them. The sound of tearing metal filled the air as Elias swung the crowbar, the blow glancing off the creature's armored hide. Carter grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench and threw it, the improvised weapon clanging harmlessly against the floor. "Run!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They sprinted back the way they came, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. Conveyor belts whirred and clattered as it pursued them, its limbs moving with terrifying efficiency. As they reached the entrance, Elias slammed his fist against the touchpad, sealing the door just as the creature lunged. The metal buckled under the impact, but the door held. For now. Gasping for breath, they stared at each other, their faces pale. The distant hum of machinery continued, unaffected by the terror they had unleashed. But now the silence felt different, alive, watchful, and waiting. The barricade Elias had hastily fashioned from crates and debris wasn't going to hold. The door they'd sealed shook violently as the creature on the other side pounded against it, its growls reverberating through the metal. Mira crouched behind a workbench, clutching her knife with trembling hands, her gaze locked on the buckling steel. Carter sat slumped next to her, his breathing ragged and shallow. Blood from his mangled arm pooled on the floor, soaking into the fabric of his sleeve. "Tell me that thing can't get through," Mira hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the door's control panel, a flickering screen that displayed warnings in red text. He wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers hovering over the buttons as he tried to think. The creature's claws raked against the door, each screech sending a fresh wave of tension through the room. "It's buying us time," Elias finally said, though he didn't sound confident. He glanced at Carter, his face darkening. "We need to get him out of here, that arm. He won't last if we don't stop the bleeding." Mira nodded, pulling a torn strip of fabric tighter around Carter's arm. He groaned but didn't protest. She looked up at Elias, her voice steadier now. "And go where? It's out there waiting for us." Elias gestured toward a grated vent on the far wall, partially obscured by a stack of crates. "Through there," he said. "We can use the maintenance tunnels. They're narrow, but it won't be able to follow us." Mira hesitated, staring at the vent. It was barely large enough to fit through, and the thought of crawling into the dark, confined space made her stomach turn. But the alternative was worse. She nodded again, more firmly this time. "Help me move these crates." Together they cleared the path, the sound of scraping metal blending with the relentless pounding at the door. Carter groaned as they hoisted him toward the vent, his body limp and uncooperative. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered, his voice slurred. "You know that, right?" "Shut up and crawl," Mira shot back, though there was no malice in her tone. She shoved him into the vent first, her movements quick and efficient. Elias followed, his shoulders barely fitting through the narrow opening. Mira climbed in last, pulling the grate shut behind her. The vent was suffocatingly tight, the metal walls pressing in on all sides. The air was damp and carried a faint, sour odor that made Mira gag. Ahead of her, Carter dragged himself forward with one arm, his breaths coming in short, pained gasps. Elias led the way, his flashlight casting a thin beam of light that revealed nothing but more darkness. Behind them, the pounding on the door stopped. The silence was worse. Mira froze, her heart racing as she strained to listen. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of their breathing, amplified in the confined space. Then it came, a low, guttural clicking, echoing faintly through the vents. It was ahead of them. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's in here." He didn't respond. Instead, he quickened his pace, his flashlight sweeping back and forth as he searched for an exit. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and Mira felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. Whatever this thing was, it was moving through the walls, its body scraping against the metal as it closed in on them. Carter groaned again, louder this time, and Elias whipped his head around. "Quiet," he snapped, his voice sharp. "It's tracking us by sound." Carter bit back a retort, his teeth clenched as he continued to drag himself forward. The tunnel seemed endless, each turn identical to the last. The sound of the creature grew louder, the clicks accompanied by faint, wet squelches that made Mira's stomach churn. It was too close. "Left," Elias said suddenly, his flashlight catching the edge of another vent. He scrambled toward it, ripping the grate open with frantic urgency. Mira pushed Carter through first, the medic collapsing onto the floor of a dimly lit corridor. She followed, her breath hitching as she felt the vent behind her vibrate. It was there. Elias pulled her out just as a grotesque appendage shot through the vent, a spindly clawed limb that writhed and twisted as it searched for them. Mira stumbled back, watching in horror as the limb retracted, only to be replaced by another. The creature's clicking was deafening now, its body slamming against the narrow vent as it tried to force its way through. "Move," Elias barked, pulling her to her feet. The corridor they had entered was different from the upper levels. The walls were lined with pipes, many of which were encrusted with a strange, organic growth that pulsed faintly. The air was thick and humid, making it difficult to breathe. Elias didn't stop to inspect their surroundings, his focus solely on finding a way out. The sound of the creature faded as they put distance between themselves and the vent, but Mira knew it wasn't far. It had found them once. It would find them again. As they turned a corner, Elias stopped abruptly, his flashlight illuminating something that made Mira's stomach drop. The walls ahead of them weren't metal, they were flesh. Veins pulsed beneath the translucent surface, and a sickly green light seeped through the organic material. The pipes running along the ceiling were tangled with tendrils, some of which twitched as they approached. "What the hell is this?" Mira whispered, her voice trembling. Elias didn't answer. He stepped closer, his flashlight sweeping over the grotesque sight. The walls seemed to react to the light, shivering as though alive. Carter groaned behind them, his strength failing as he leaned against the wall for support. "Don't touch," Elias began, but it was too late. The wall pulsed violently where Carter had leaned, a ripple spreading outward like a stone dropped into water. From the ceiling, something detached and dropped to the floor with a wet splat. It writhed for a moment before righting itself, revealing a shape that was all too familiar. A twisted fusion of flesh and metal, its many limbs twitching as it let out a guttural hiss. Elias grabbed Carter, pulling him back as the creature lunged. Mira reacted instinctively, plunging her knife into its side. The blade sank in, but the creature barely flinched. It turned toward her, its many eyes gleaming with malice. "Run!" Elias shouted, shoving Mira toward the corridor behind them. She didn't need to be told twice. Adrenaline surged through her as she sprinted down the corridor, Carter stumbling after her with Elias supporting him. The creature gave chase, its movements erratic but horrifyingly fast. The corridor twisted and turned, the walls growing more organic with every step. Mira's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She could feel the creature behind her, its claws scraping against the floor. Ahead, the corridor opened into a larger space. Elias pushed them through, slamming a heavy metal door shut behind them. The creature slammed against it moments later, the impact reverberating through the room. For now, they were safe. But as Mira looked around the strange, fleshy chamber, her relief was short-lived. The walls were alive, and they were breathing. The corridor sloped downward, drawing them deeper into the bowels of the factory. The air grew thicker with every step, saturated with a humid, metallic tang that clung to their throats. The steady hum of the machinery above faded into a distant memory, replaced by a faint, organic squelching that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. Elias led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Behind him, Mira half-carried, half-dragged Carter, whose pallor had turned ghostly. His mangled arm dangled uselessly at his side, the makeshift bandage soaked through with blood that had darkened to an alarming shade of black. He mumbled incoherently, his words lost to fever and shock. "Elias," Mira whispered harshly, her voice tinged with desperation. "We have to stop. He's not going to make it much further." Elias glanced back, his jaw tight. "We stop. We die. That thing isn't going to give up, and I'd bet my life it's not the only one." Mira's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she shifted Carter's weight and forced herself to keep moving. The walls around them began to change, the smooth steel giving way to an unsettling mix of machinery and flesh. Organic tendrils snaked through the pipes, pulsating in time with some unseen rhythm. The floor beneath their feet grew slick, and the sound of their footsteps was muffled by a layer of viscous slime. "What is this place?" Mira murmured, her voice barely audible. Elias didn't respond, but the flashlight's beam trembled slightly in his hand. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and the sight before them forced both of them to stop. The heart of the factory had been transformed into a grotesque, living machine. Pods hung from the ceiling in uneven rows, their translucent surfaces glowing with a sickly green light. Inside each one, shadowy figures writhed, their outlines humanoid but distorted. Veins and cables intertwined in a chaotic web, connecting the pods to a massive central structure that pulsed with life. The structure was a horrifying fusion of flesh and metal, its surface crawling with movement. Tubes extended from its bloated mass, pumping black fluid into the pods with a sound like a beating heart. Carter groaned weakly, stirring at the noise. Mira shook her head, her face pale. This isn't possible." Elias took a step forward, his flashlight illuminating the nearest pod. The figure inside twitched in response, pressing against the membrane. Its face, or what was left of it, was turned toward them. Its features were warped, melted together into something barely recognizable as human. Its mouth stretched open, revealing a row of jagged teeth, and it let out a muffled scream that vibrated through the chamber. Mira recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. "Are those people?" "They were," Elias said grimly. "Not anymore." The central structure let out a low, resonant growl, and the tubes attached to it convulsed. The black fluid surged faster, filling the pods with an audible gurgle. One of the pods burst open with a sickening squelch, spilling its contents onto the floor. The creature that emerged was barely formed, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it struggled to stand. Its skin was translucent, revealing black veins that throbbed beneath the surface. It turned toward them, its featureless face tilting curiously, before letting out a guttural shriek. Elias pulled his knife, motioning for Mira to get back. "It knows we're here." Before they could react, more pods began to burst open, their occupants spilling onto the floor in a chaotic wave. Some creatures stumbled aimlessly, their bodies not yet fully formed, while others moved with terrifying precision, their limbs cracking into place as they stalked forward. "Run," Elias said, his voice low and urgent. They turned and fled, Carter's body dragging like dead weight between them. The creatures gave chase, their shrieks filling the air. The corridor narrowed as they retraced their steps, the sound of their pursuers growing louder with every passing second. The walls around them pulsed with life, tendrils reaching out as if trying to snare them. Ahead, a heavy door loomed, partially open. Elias surged forward, pushing the others through before slamming it shut. He threw his weight against it as the creatures reached the other side, their claws scraping violently against the metal. "That's not going to hold," Mira said, her voice shaking. Elias scanned the room. It was smaller than the chamber they'd escaped, but just as twisted. The machinery here was still functional, its mechanisms encrusted with organic growth. A control panel flickered faintly on the far wall, its surface covered in a fine layer of slime. "There has to be a way to stop this," Elias said, his voice tight. He moved toward the panel, wiping away the slime with his sleeve. The screen displayed a series of diagrams, each one more incomprehensible than the last. But one thing was clear. The pods weren't the end. The factory was preparing shipments, loading these abominations into crates to be sent beyond the city. "They're spreading," Elias said, his voice hollow. "This isn't just here. These things, they're everywhere." Mira stared at him, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. "How do we stop it?" Elias didn't answer. He scrolled through the panel, his fingers trembling. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a core override sequence. It would trigger a meltdown, destroying the factory and everything in it. But it came with a price. "There's no time to get clear," he said quietly. Mira stepped forward, her jaw set. "Then we do it anyway. Better us than whatever this is." Carter stirred weakly, his voice barely audible. Just do it," he murmured. "End this." Elias hesitated for a moment before nodding. He began entering the sequence, his movements deliberate. Behind them, the pounding on the door grew louder, the metal starting to bend under the force. The creatures were breaking through. As Elias finished the sequence, the machinery around them began to whir and sputter. The room trembled, and the walls pulsed violently as the factory's systems started to collapse. The door burst open, and the creatures poured in, their shrieks blending with the sounds of the dying factory. Elias grabbed Mira and Carter, pulling them toward a nearby access tunnel. "Move!" he shouted. They stumbled through the tunnel as the factory began to implode behind them, fire and molten metal consuming everything. The creatures' screams were drowned out by the roar of the explosion, and the ground shook violently beneath their feet. They emerged into the open air, collapsing onto the cracked asphalt as the factory collapsed in on itself. The shockwave knocked them flat, and for a moment, everything was silent. Mira coughed, struggling to sit up. Beside her, Elias stared at the smoldering ruin, his expression grim. Carter lay motionless, his breath shallow but steady. But the silence didn't last. A faint hum broke through the stillness, and they turned to see a delivery drone rising from the wreckage, its cargo intact. In the distance, more drones appeared, their glowing eyes piercing through the smoke. Mira's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not over." The factory was gone, consumed by fire and fury, but the world it left behind was no less terrifying. The acrid smell of burning metal hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sickly sweet stench of organic decay. Mira sat on the cracked asphalt, her hands trembling as she tightened the tourniquet on Carter's ruined arm. His breathing was faint, uneven, his fevered eyes staring blankly at the smoke-choked sky. Elias stood nearby, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the factory's remains. He didn't speak, didn't move, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Mira followed his line of sight and her heart sank. The drones were still coming. The faint hum grew louder, a swarm of glowing lights weaving through the smoky air like fireflies. Each drone carried a crate, their cargo intact despite the destruction. The delivery routes had been programmed to persist, automated systems ensuring the shipments would continue, no matter what stood in their way. And now, in the wake of the collapse, there was nothing left to stop them. "They're spreading," Mira said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt hollow, inadequate to describe the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Elias finally turned to her, his expression grim. "It's not just here. This factory was just one of many. These things, whatever they are, they've already won." Mira's chest tightened. She looked down at Carter, his face pale and clammy, then back to Elias. "We have to warn someone. If there's anyone left—" Elias cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "There's no one left, Mira. You saw the cities. You've seen what's out there. This isn't about saving anyone anymore. It's about surviving." "Surviving?" Mira's voice cracked, anger and despair bubbling to the surface. "For what? So we can watch those things take over everything? What's the point?" Elias didn't answer. He just looked away, his silence speaking volumes. The hum of the drones grew deafening as the first of them descended, its sleek body glinting in the dim light. It hovered above the ground, its cargo bay opening with a mechanical whir. Mira tensed, her knife clutched tightly in her hand, but the drone didn't attack. Instead, it released its crate with a gentle thud, then ascended back into the air, vanishing into the night. The crate sat motionless, its surface pristine despite the carnage around it. Mira stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could see faint movement through the translucent panels, the same sickening writhing she had seen in the factory. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. Elias approached the crate cautiously, his knife drawn. He knelt beside it, his breath shallow as he inspected the seams. The latches were simple, designed for easy opening. "Don't," Mira said, her voice sharp. "We already know what's inside." "We don't know enough," Elias replied, his tone steady. "If we're going to stop this, somehow, we need to understand it." Before Mira could argue, he unlatched the crate and lifted the lid. The smell hit them first, a noxious blend of ammonia and decay that made Mira gag. Inside, something pulsed and writhed, encased in a thin membrane. The creature was small, malformed, its limbs twitching spasmodically as though struggling to break free. Black veins spread across its translucent skin, throbbing in rhythm with the faint sound of a heartbeat. Mira took a step back, her hand over her mouth. It's growing. Elias's face hardened. He grabbed a nearby piece of debris, a jagged shard of metal, and raised it above the crate. But before he could bring it down, the creature's movements changed. Its head, if it could be called that, twisted toward him, and for a brief moment its body convulsed violently. Then it stopped, its malformed limbs curling inward as if shielding itself. "It's reacting to you," Mira said, her voice barely audible. "It knows we're here." Elias hesitated, the shard trembling in his hand. "They're intelligent," he said, his voice tight. "Not just machines, not just things. They're learning." The realization hung heavy between them, more suffocating than the smoke. Elias lowered the shard, his shoulders slumping. Destroying one wouldn't change anything. The drones would keep coming. The factories would keep producing. The creatures would keep evolving. "What do we do?" Mira asked, the desperation in her voice cutting through the silence. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the horizon, where the faint glow of distant factories pierced the darkness. "We find another factory," he said finally. "We keep moving, and when we find it, we destroy it." "And then what?" Mira demanded. "There are thousands of these places, maybe millions. You said it yourself. We can't stop them." Elias met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then we buy time, as much time as we can." Mira wanted to scream, to cry, to fight against the crushing inevitability of it all. But instead she just nodded, her body sagging with exhaustion. She looked down at Carter, who had fallen unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. If nothing else, they owed it to him to keep going, to try. The hum of the drones faded into the distance, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. The crate remained where it was, its occupant twitching faintly beneath the membrane. Elias closed the lid, securing it with trembling hands. Then he stood, his knife still clenched tightly in his fist. "Let's move," he said, "before more of them show up." They trudged into the night, their footsteps heavy against the cracked pavement. The ruins of the city loomed around them, silent witnesses to the end of the world. The air was thick with smoke and despair, but somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of machinery persisted, a reminder that the factories were still running, their purpose unchanged. As they disappeared into the shadows, a delivery drone hovered above the crate they had left behind. It scanned the area briefly before descending, its mechanical arms securing the cargo. With a faint hum, it lifted into the air and disappeared into the dark, carrying its grotesque shipment to the next destination. And the question lingered, unanswered. Who or what was still waiting to receive it?